Welcome to another edition of the Voice of Palestine, Voice of the Palestinian People. It's April 23rd, 2014, and I'm your co-host, Hanna Kawas. This week, we are interviewing Alison Weir, a journalist and a founder of the group If Americans Knew. We will talk with her about the group's work and objectives, the floundering U.S. peace process, as well as her new book, Against Our Better Judgement. Good afternoon to you and Alison, and welcome again to the Voice of Palestine.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me to be on your show again.
You know, we last time we talked about the role of the American media in specific, the AP in specific, in covering up for Israel war crimes. You know, we could talk a little bit about that, and I was surprised really recently. Do you think there is change in specifically AP? Because, you know, when they arrested an American Palestinian just last week and arrested some journalists from inside Israel when he came back from Lebanon, they really, you know, dared to ask the question for American officials if they did anything about them. What do you think?
Well, I think the more we expose the fact that they are doing very unsatisfactory journalism and that they have, you know, such a clearly demonstrable bias towards Israel, that the more we expose that, it does cause them to improve somewhat. Mm-hmm. So I think there's been some factors, you know, some improvement. It's still, the coverage is still usually, at minimum, very Israeli-centric. Yeah. And they still, you know, it's the same pattern continues, but I don't think it's necessarily quite as bad as it was before. Yeah. They want to try to prove that we're wrong. Yeah. By doing more, and that's good. I'd love them to prove us wrong by covering it honestly and accurately now. So I hope they'll do that someday.
No, I think so. Yeah, I think they're trying, you know, to, prove that their claim to objectivity and neutrality and, you know, that the impartiality is correct, which is, we know, everybody knows. And with the internet, I think that's an important tool for us to expose what they are doing. You know, can you tell us a bit about what you're doing nowadays? And what's more your main emphasis as a group, If Americans Knew?
Sure. I'd be glad to. And I should mention, I actually am heading up two groups now on this issue. Yeah. The other one is the Council for the National Interest, which has been around for about 20 years. In fact, it's probably a little bit over 20 years now. It was founded by former congressmen and ambassadors to specifically try to counter the propaganda and the lobbying by the Israel lobby, especially by AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. But as I'm sure you know, and I expect your listeners know, the Israel lobby is much more than just AIPAC. And, you know, there are many other organizations within it. Yeah. So this organization, another nonprofit, was started about 20 years ago called the Council for the National Interest to get the information to the American public and try to push for American policies that are beneficial to Americans and that are also based on principles of justice and fairness. Mm-hmm. So I'm doing both of those organizations, and in both of them, the main goal, first of all, is just to get the information out to the general public. I find that when Americans learn the actual history and learn the actual facts of what's going on, in almost all cases they are extremely outraged to hear what the situation is and to realize that Americans give Israel over $8 million per day of our tax money. So, you know, that's sort of our first step to try to get that information to the public.
Yeah, I think it's, to me, really, it's more the money is an issue, but it's more the cover for their war crimes, whether diplomatically or politically, at the United Nations and everywhere else, because, without this cover, Israel will be sent to the Hague, to the International Court of Justice. But
that's right.
Yeah. So, the American policy, these people who determine it, I want to understand. I mean, obviously, it's like people shooting themselves in the foot. And we're seeing the recent 3-4 years, the Arab uprisings, what they call it here, the Arab Spring. I mean, if this Arab Spring is successful and it takes its full potential without trying to stop it by the outside powers, mainly the U.S., I think, and they realize that if people in the Arab world take their destiny into their own hands, the U.S. will be the main loser, economically at least. And, I think the Arab people will say, no more oil, like they did in 73, And what will happen to this empire? I mean,
that's the challenge, is to get that kind of information out to the U.S. public. Because U.S. policies are, in addition to just being extremely tragic in what they're doing against Palestinians and other people throughout the region who have suffered from, these ruthless Israeli attacks so often. But in addition to that, they're causing great damage to the United States. They're causing animosity because of what we are funding. And as you say, because we're blocking resolutions at the Security Council and in the UN and other agencies where the U.S. consistently vetoes things on behalf of Israel. And this has been going on for well over 60 years. In fact, far longer than that. I've just researched this in great depth and have just published a book about how the, quote, U.S.-Israel special relationship was created. And it's an astounding story of manipulation of the American public by the fanatic ideology called Zionism, which most people in the United States have never even heard of, to push the U.S. into taking actions that are damaging to the United States.
Yeah. Are you talking about
the short story?
Yeah.
It's been going on for many years, and yet we have some prominent people in the United States, probably worldwide, who are supposedly solidarity with Palestine activists who try to block that particular information from getting out to the public. So it's very insidious. It's not only being blocked by Israel partisans, by all of these different well-funded entities within the Israel lobby, who consistently make up this myth that U.S. policies are actually good for the U.S., which they're not. But you have people within the movement trying to spread that misinformation also.
Yeah. You're talking about your recent book, Against Our Better Judgement. Could you tell us a bit about it, since you mentioned that what did you, what motivated you to write it, and what's the content, and how far in history did you go?
I'd be glad to. It's what motivated me, and this will take a little while, but my background, just for any of your listeners that didn't hear our last show, I'm not Jewish or Arab or Palestinian or Muslim. So my background is Christian, and I really never used to pay much attention to Israel-Palestine. That's how the general American public is. There are many, many important issues. It's very difficult to try to keep up with all of them. Even just to keep up with all the important domestic issues. So especially international issues the average person doesn't necessarily know very much about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like that. I didn't have a strong view. I was sympathetic towards Israel, but I didn't know much about it until the fall of 2000, when the Second Palestinian Intifada erupted. It was in the news for a while. I decided to pay attention to it and notice how one-sided the coverage was. That's what triggered me looking into it more and more. I was so astonished and outraged at what I discovered, which seemed like a major cover-up in the United States, that after several months, I decided to go over as a freelance reporter in early 2001 and travel around the occupied territories, Gaza and the West Bank, just by myself to see what was going on. And so that was my awakening. It was fall of 2000 and early 2001. So when I came back from that trip, I started the organization If Americans Knew. And at that time, I began, in addition to researching and learning firsthand what was going on in the region right now, I began reading books about the history of it to understand how Israel had come into existence. Fairly quickly, that was understandable. There are, many very excellent books on that. But I was especially curious, too, about why the U.S. would support Israel. Israel has no natural resources. It has no oil. It's tiny. And, of course, at the beginning, it was even had a tinier population. So what did the U.S. get out of this special relationship? So I started reading all of these books, largely published by mainstream publishers and well-regarded authors, but fairly obscure. Most people didn't know about them. And then I would read the footnote to see where that information was coming from, and then get that book, read those footnotes, and get those books. And so about the last 12 years or more, I've been reading books about this issue that contained extremely strong information that I realized that almost nobody else seemed to know. Parts of it other people knew, but some of it very few people know. So I finally decided I needed to write an article about that. I've been writing quite a few articles, and I decided I needed to write an article about this history, about how the U.S. became such a strong supporter of Israel, really even though it damages us, how we got to that point. And in trying to write the article, there was too much to say in one article by far, so it's turned into a book. And it's fully cited. I have, in fact, over half of the book are citations telling exactly where I got the information, and often given additional information, that you can look at in the footnote.
Yeah. So you think the American administration or American politicians do you think that they are not responsible for what they are doing? You think the influence of the Israel lobby is the main motivation for them, or isn't there more than that? Like Chomsky said, Israel to the American administration is a warplane carrier in the Middle East.
That's the narrative that Israel loves. Israel planted that narrative in probably about the early 1970s when they began getting so much more money. Then at that point it became necessary. Before that, a lot of money went from the U.S. to Israel. But it was largely because of the Holocaust, because of the Nazis' sympathy for the Jewish refugees, and it was being portrayed to Americans as this was just an empty land and it was to help Jewish victims, and so there was sympathy, and massive amounts of money went to that supposedly wonderful new state of Israel without people being aware that it meant a major dispossession and ethnic cleansing of people that were on the land, a very ruthless one. But, that was the narrative by which Israel got American support. But then, after so many years, and when the amount of money went up so much, the decision was made that Americans needed to think that this was in our interest. Even though we had very strong relationships with the Arab world that does have oil, that does control the Suez Canal, for example, that has, over 1 billion consumers, somehow there's this narrative that Chomsky loves repeating that benefits Israel, that claims that this tiny little country of Israel is, for some reason, valuable to the United States. And it's just fairly ludicrous that argument is made. I mean, a lot of people make it that are intelligent, and they've heard it from Chomsky, so Chomsky is very admirable in a great deal of his work. So it gets repeated without anybody examining it thoroughly to see, well, does that make sense? Does the evidence really support that?
Yeah, but the 67 war, one of the proof of that, basically, and it's true later, after the 73 war, the U.S. counted less and less on Israel, especially when they went to war in Iraq. And that's true. But my question was really, it's not really only. I mean, they're not kids, the American politicians, and they're not kids, and we can't really just say
they want to get reelected.
Yeah, they want
to get reelected.
Yeah, that's one thing, and the other thing, I mean, they should be held responsible for their actions, and it's true. It's not just the Zionist Jewish lobby in the U.S. There is 72 million Christian Zionists who influence also the decision in Washington. So it is really a mass movement in the U.S. I mean, 72 million is not a joke, really.
Well, we don't know. Actually, nobody has. Let me, if I could just maybe break in here.
Sure.
When you read my book, you'll see that this sort of Christian Zionist movement, as it's called, which is really an oxymoron, because it's very unchristian, but that was largely pushed through the Israel lobby, beginning in at the early part of the century. And then in the 20s it was pushed some more, and then in the early 40s it was financed by Israel.
That's true.
They put some front groups that were Christian groups, gave them a massive amount of money, sometimes told them what to do, and created this now very large population that, again, doesn't know what's going on because the media reinforce Israel as victim. So it's not just when I'm talking about the lobby, I'm not just talking about the political lobby in D.C. I'm talking about in the media, ownership, advertisers, editors, correspondents with very strong emotional and sometimes very close personal ties to Israel. I'm also talking about in the United States, every state, and a great many cities have a Jewish relations, Jewish JCRC, a Jewish federation, that when you go on their website, these on their website proclaim that they advocate on behalf of Israel. On practically every campus in the United States, you have a Hillel chapter. But I used to think that it was a very wonderful thing. It was for Jewish students to come together and perhaps, have cultural and religious center for them on campus, and it does do that. But it also, again, very publicly announces on the websites that they advocate for Israel. So we have this massively embedded lobby on behalf of a foreign country that was created beginning in the late 1880s and 1890s. By 1910, there were 20,000 Zionists in the United States. By 1920, there were 200,000 Zionists. And as you know, this was a political movement. It's not a religious movement. It was, for many decades, a minority of the Jewish population, most of whom were either non-Zionists or in some cases were actively anti-Zionist. But it was a very devoted special interest group, ideological group, that by 1910 was already becoming influential with politicians in the major eastern cities in particular. Then in 1914, we had a very important, very famous lawyer in the United States named Louis Brandeis became a Zionist, In fact, this may be new to you. It was new to me.
Yeah.
He became the head of World Zionism in 1914. So the World Zionism, the headquarters for the World Zionist Organization was in the United States, with Louis Brandeis as the head of it. Then in 1916, Woodrow Wilson, the president at that time, appointed Louis Brandeis to the Supreme Court. As you know, this is the highest court of the land, very, very powerful court. Those 12 members of the Supreme Court are equal to the hundreds of people in Congress in our checks and balances system. So Louis Brandeis became a Supreme Court justice, at which point he was supposed to resign all of his affiliations, board memberships and clubs and positions, to be an objective, neutral person. But even though he did that publicly, he remained the head of the World Zionist Organization, and his lieutenants would come into his private Supreme Court chambers and report to him what they were doing on behalf of Zionism, both in the United States and elsewhere, and then he would give them orders for them to carry out. And this is, to somebody like myself 15 years ago, that would sound like a, quote, conspiracy theory, which, of course, that always is an epithet. Nobody should allegedly believe conspiracy theories. And I would have been very skeptical, as people should be. But what I've just told you is in many mainstream books. Even books by Israel partisans have written about this many times. But it hasn't made it out to the general public. So most Americans have no idea that went on. So we have a lobby in the United States that it began becoming active in this country before I'm not young, and this was before my parents were born. Yeah. It was very strategic. It focused on the points of power in the United States. By 1940, had a massively large budget. It was $500,000, and back then that was, one nickel would buy you a loaf of bread. So that was a huge amount of money. Yeah. And by a few years later, they had access to a larger fund that was about $14 million. And 5 years later, they had access to, I think it was $150 million, which in today's dollars, that's the equivalent of about $1 trillion, maybe $2 trillion, to use in manipulating and propagandizing every sector of the U.S. society, not just Congress people. Of course, they were, getting campaign donations and reports and being encouraged to push for Zionism, both parties equally. But it also went to Christian clergy. They targeted them for propaganda. It went to labor unions, targeted them for propaganda, targeted business, targeted academia, university presidents, and all of this is completely documented. Yeah. It's not ancient history. It's not as though we're having to go back with archaeology. The archives are around. The Zionists sometimes had annual reports. The one organization, the American Zionist Emergency Committee, AZEC, would have annual reports telling what they had done. Yeah. So much of it was done publicly, although semi-publicly. Most people had no idea what was going on. Yeah. Yeah, no, they do it for sure behind the scenes. But I wanted. This is basically in your book, all this picture. Yes, it is.
Yeah. So, is there any other things in the book aside from showing historically the influence of the Zionist lobby in the U.S.?
Well, the goal of the book was to tell how the U.S. How the special interest, how the close relationship was created. Because, as you know, without the U.S., Israel would not be successful. Yeah, that's so it was, well, how and why did that come about? And I had no, it would be much easier to just say, oh, this is U.S. empire, it's the oil, it's, U.S. establishment pushing it. I would be called, I would not be called so many names. But that's just not true. when I did the research, I discovered that was not true, and I discovered that, and again, many other people, I hope you'll read the book, read the citations. Many other people have written about this, but not Noam Chomsky. But there were many State Department reports, Pentagon reports, intelligence agencies, all saying that Zionism was harmful, that basically it was not founded on any kind of principle other than to dispossess people that were in their way, that it would hurt the U.S. to do it. They had memos predicting the kind of chaos and bloodshed that was created by Israel's founding war. I also found that and again, this is, I was starting from scratch, so some people that think they know this issue don't research it because, of course, they think they know it. They've grown up with it and do know a great deal about it. But very few people have really ever taken the time, because they already knew so much. You don't research something when you know it, to research the U.S. aspect. So a lot of things that turn out to be inaccurate are repeated and repeated. And usually the things that are repeated sort of tend to help Israel.
Yeah, and I'm sure you're aware of the CIA statement after the partition plan, and they warned of grave consequences to the American policy if they support it.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear what you
I
said.
I'm sure you are aware of the CIA memo in 1947 when the partition plan came into being at the United Nations, that they warned of grave consequences if the
That's right.
State
Exactly.
of Israel was
That's
established.
right.
Yeah. So I'm just trying
That's right, and there were many of those.
So
stressing that the Middle East was strategic. They were stressing that the oil was important to the U.S., and all of these would be hurt by supporting Zionism.
So, again, I think the American politicians should bear responsibility and for what they're doing, and they should be judged on what they decide to do. I mean, if they are influenced, then they are, they carry responsibility of their actions. And this will lead us to why nowadays, the American administration under Obama leading this fruitless and, really deceiving so-called peace process. What do you think of it? And obviously, the Palestinian, even the Palestinian collaborators are not buying it. I'm referring to the PA. So, even Abbas rejected what they're trying to impose on the Palestinians. So could you tell us, what's the objective of this administration and why they're doing it? I mean, either they want a peace process and they should enforce it.
But they don't.
They have influence on Israel. I mean, look, Pollard been sitting in jail for God knows how many decades, and the Israel with all its lobby couldn't release him. So if they want to be firm, they could, but still, I mean, they obviously they're not intending.
I'd be glad to answer that. The thing is that it actually is as bad as I'm saying. It actually is for the most part, what drives U.S. policies regarding Israel for the most part, it's really very simple. Once I discovered this, it was very little occurs that's surprising once you know what's going on. The Israel lobby in this country is what drives our policies. No, it's not to say that any lobby is successful 100% of the time. I don't think we would ever say that anything 100% of the time has the same result. So they occasionally will lose a battle. They occasionally will not get fully what they want. Maybe they're down to 70% or 80%. I would guess it's probably closer to 90%. So it's very easy to pick up and say, well, look at this. This proves the lobby is not successful. But all it proves is no. It's not 100%, but no one would claim that it is.
Mm-hmm.
So it's decisive, though. Time after time, that's what's driving it. And as you say, it's not to excuse politicians who are giving in to basically to threats. They're giving in to threats. Is what's going on, and they certainly are responsible for their own action. But let's just look at this realistically. Say politicians in the House of Representatives, their terms are 2 years. Every 2 years, they run for office again. If a politician in a typical American city where the newspaper gets AP and the New York Times wire service, and so the population is very misinformed about Israel-Palestine. Now, let's say that their representative actually knew about Israel-Palestine and tried to vote to do the right thing. Maybe voted, let's just imagine this, but imagine that politician voted against aid to Israel. Then, of course, we know what would happen. That politician, that district, he or she would be up for election. Within 2 years, they would be up for election. At that point, the Israel lobby would target that district. They would find either there would already be another candidate that they would fund, or they would find a candidate to put up against that politician. They would funnel money from often from out of state. Israel partisans around the country would send in massive amounts of campaign donations to the opposing candidate. That candidate then would have lots of money to have an excellent political team, the best political team money can buy, the best advertisements money can buy, the best television ads, billboards, maybe not even mentioning anything to do with Israel. In the district, maybe jobs would be the big thing, or maybe it would be an environmental district, in which case they would look like the best person on the environment, or maybe it would be a farm district, and they would look like the best person, for farmers. But really, what would happen is that the politician who tried to do the right thing, not caving into pressure, would get thrown out within 2 years. So if you're a politician in Congress and you're smart enough enough to have gotten elected, you know the system. And you know that even if you did the right thing, you would probably lose the next election, so what good would it do? So I'm sure it's not difficult to rationalize it. Well, even if I did the right thing, it would not do any good because I'd get thrown out and nobody would even know why, because I would have so little money compared to my opponent. Now, it's not 100%. There are a few districts where their representatives vote fairly well, but it's close to 100%.
You reminded me of the book, The Best Congress Money Can Buy, by Paul Findlay, I believe, wasn't it?
Well, Paul Findlay wrote They Dare to Speak Out. But it's the same idea. He
had a book also. I think it is Paul Findlay, as I recall. He wrote a book, The Best Congress Money Can Buy. But that fits with your theory, basically, that, the lobby, the Israel lobby, really emphasize on the politicians, and they try to manipulate the outcome of election, which shows you how democratic the process is. Having said that, what about the peace process? It's at a deadlock now. Do you have any idea, where to, and how it's going to affect strategically U.S. interests? Obviously, these politicians should be taken in consideration, the strategic interests of the nation and the people of the U.S.
I think, again, they try to, but if they're going to be elected, be thrown out in 2 weeks. Now, somebody like Kerry, of course, is not running for election, so he's supposedly serving the U.S. interests, but he is serving the president. And the president, of course, was largely funded by the Israel lobby. Some of his major donors from the very beginning were Israel partisans. His first speech when he received the Democratic nomination the first time, it's pretty much his first public speech after that wasn't before the Israel lobby, the AIPAC, American Israel Public Affairs Committee. So, he's they're very powerful with him. Nevertheless, I think that there are indications that he has tried at times to do what he could within those chains, that he has appointed Chuck Hagel as Secretary of Defense, who used to be fairly good on this issue, but now he's very fearful, so he keeps taking very pro-Israel stands.
Yeah.
So I think when you look at Obama's actions, and some of his speeches have been very contradictory, but some, like that Cairo speech, were fairly decent, talking about the Palestinian situation. Mm-hmm. So I think he's done what he thinks he can do. But again, let's think about if he did the right thing, what would happen. And it's one of these sort of thought experiments like Einstein would do. And what would happen if he did, and what does happen when he does something that's even close to the right thing? The media are often very much spinning it in a negative way. There are lots of, quote, pundits that are spinning it in a negative way. The Congress is attacking him, especially the opposing party that always uses that as a reason to oppose the sitting president. So he gets attacked massively for that. And ultimately, in most cases, George Bush did the same thing at times, said the right thing. Even Reagan at times tried to do things that were fairly good. And then they end up backing off because the lobby is ultimately more powerful than the president. Mm-hmm. So it's strange. Now, it's more obvious why they would do that in their first term, of course, because they wanted to get a second term. Mm-hmm. But I used to wonder why, I would be hopeful when the second term they could do more. Mm-hmm. And actually, but I think why they don't is that even though they cannot be elected again, there are only 2 terms, so that's it for being the president. And there's that's the highest elected office, so it's not that they're going to run for office again. Yeah. But I think that what keeps them from doing what they should do, as much as I would wish they would do it, is that they still want to remain powerful in the political system. Yeah. When they're out of office, then usually a president can still sort of he's still a player, a kingmaker. They're inside, choosing the next candidate for the party. But if he didn't do that, look at Jimmy Carter. Yeah. After he wrote his book, Peace Not Apartheid, the Democratic Party, which is largely funded by Zionists, barely would even, a former president is brought up on stage and he's a big star. Jimmy Carter was barely even acknowledged. Yeah, yeah. And so therefore it's no longer, these people that become president are ambitious. They don't want to suddenly be without power. Yeah, yeah. I think that's...
Yeah, you're really painting a gloomy picture that there is nothing could happen, no change could happen from within. Because
I'm glad you brought that up, because it's gloomy if we expect the establishment to do it. Yeah. I don't expect the establishment will do it. They've actually, people within the establishment have tried for decades, going back, to the 1912, 1920. So that, I have very little hope for that. Maybe I'm wrong, but I have very little hope for that. Yeah. But I have a great deal of confidence in the general public. Yeah. And the fact that now there are a great many groups, not just our the 2 groups I have. There are many, many groups around the U.S., a very diverse movement on campuses, among conservatives, among leftists, among liberals. Yeah. There are groups and individuals that are working on this. Yeah. We have the internet, so we have social networking. Some of our posts on If Americans Do, 40,000 people see them, sometimes more than that. Yeah. So we put on a major event in Washington, D.C. last week that was broadcast live by C-SPAN, in which we had establishment national security experts saying very factually how much the U.S. policies hurt Americans.
Mm-hmm.
So there is this movement, very much a grassroots movement, that has steadily been growing, and that's where my.
Yeah.
So I am optimistic.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I am optimistic that this will change.
Yeah, and I am optimistic, and I think the influence from outside, like for us Arabs and Palestinians, to take a real clear-cut stand against what the U.S. administration is doing to not just to the Arab world, to all humans all over the world. This will put pressure and force them to change position. But we need a new spring. Arab Spring, and not the spring that's been diverted by U.S. policies and their puppets in the Arab world.
Right.
This is also, they go hand in hand of change from the groups you said. And, just you reminded me, I just want to talk with you about, your group was one of 10 that was listed on the Zionist, the most anti-Israel groups. I think it's the ADL that posted it, and I don't think it was the first year for your group to be listed, but it's worth noting that there are 2 Jewish groups on this list, including the Neturei Karta and the Jewish Voice for Peace, Jewish Voices for Peace. So why they are threatened by these solidarity groups that you refer to, and why they feel they have to have a list or to, say...
That's right.
Yeah, could you...
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it's because, and I even wrote an article about that, because they, what Zionists have done since, from the beginning is they don't want anybody to even get a little bit powerful. They're very, very strategic and really relentless.
Mm-hmm.
So even though our groups, our budgets are just a tiny fraction of what theirs are.
Yeah.
Their executive director gets more than our 2 budgets combined, much more.
Yeah.
But we actually are a threat. I think all of these 10 groups are a threat because they have the pro-Israel argument is so poor. Ultimately it's based on lies and manipulation.
Yeah.
The result is bad for everybody. It's bad for Israelis. It's bad for Palestinians. It's bad for Americans. It's bad for the entire world. So there's a very weak argument.
Mm-hmm.
So if we just get into the same ballpark and can get our information out to the public, which we're all starting to do, it's a house of cards that it could collapse. It's such a powerful lobby. It's so embedded, but it could collapse at some point. It will.
Yeah.
And the thing to remember, too, that's sort of there are 2 aspects that I think are grounds for optimism. One is that the U.S. is very changeable.
Mm-hmm.
It's still a young country, and we change things sometimes very quickly. And so there have been major changes in my lifetime, just major cultural changes, major political changes that wouldn't have been predicted, but suddenly now things are very different in many ways than when I was growing up. So it's a country that can change overnight. It's not really overnight, but it can seem like it. Then the other thing is that I think is hopeful is that surveys show that even though the media and really a lot of these powerful institutions are very pro-Israel and Israeli-centric, the general public is not. The general public generally says on surveys that the U.S. should not take sides.
Yeah.
In fact, about 2/3 to 3/4 of the respondents say that in surveys. And that's actually good because that means that they do not want the U.S. to veto resolutions on one side if they're not going to do it for both. Mm-hmm. It means they don't want us to give a lot of money to one side if we're not going to give it to both. They actually want the U.S. to be neutral on this, which would be an excellent change.
Yeah.
So again, now it means that up to 1/4, perhaps as high as 1/3, have strong views on it, and the majority of the people with strong views are pro-Israel.
Yeah.
Because of these decades of manipulation of the entire population, the Christian and Jewish population, both were manipulated to become pro-Israel.
Yeah.
But that means that, even though it's, say, as high as 1/3, that's, of course, millions and millions of people with strong views that will be hard to convince to change their views. Some will, but, so that's many, many people we may never get. But all you need is 51%, and potentially we have, 67 to 73%.
Yeah, and the more like the Zionists did a survey here in Canada, and I think in '93 they wanted to see why the media is against Israel. So they did the survey, and they concluded, aside from the ridiculous assumption that they, presumed for their survey, but the survey concluded that the more people know about the Palestinian-Israeli situation, the more they learn and the more they study, the more they are pro-Palestinian. So,
That's true, yeah.
So that's their survey. So it's clearly a matter of ignorance, really, that people don't really, why they support Israel, basically, because it's a matter of ignorance.
That's right. It's
Another thing, most of their advocates and their outspoken people, I call them mercenaries, because they don't do it on principle to serve humanity, but rather for money purposes and material gains. So that's another thing. While our supporters, most of them, the large majority of them, really are putting money to do this support work, and they do it from principles, So that's again. So just I wanna have your final thought on the subject, and how the situation now. I'm really optimistic, I mean, the U.S. is going down the drain economically, and eventually it'll do it militarily if they keep on this path of building military and empire and intervening all over the world,
that's right.
And the other thing, the people are waking up in all over the world, including in the Arab world, and these dictatorships and autocratic regimes are not going to be here forever, like you said. I mean, there'll be change in the U.S., there'll be change everywhere, and I think we hope it's for the better of humanity. But I'd like to have your final thought on how people could support, and how do you see the BDS movement and the victories it's having recently, and just give us your final thought, and what should people do, and where to emphasize on in their work.
Well, I think I'm very much in favor of BDS, and I'm so excited that there have been these accomplishments. So I think BDS is an excellent tactic. I think that partly one reason it's such a good tactic is it makes it a local issue, especially on campuses, for example, or in a city if they're talking about the transportation system. So that our problem is most people just think of this as a conflict far away. They don't think it has anything to do with them. They're already often financially stressed and never even start asking the questions. Once you start asking the questions, as you just noticed and noted, then you start to understand what's going on and are sympathetic to Palestinians. Once you just ask the questions and start to learn it. And BDS helps cause people to ask those questions. I think also...
it's an educational tool. It's an educational tool. You mean it's an educational...
Exactly. It is, exactly. It's a very compelling educational tool.
Sure.
And then also, my book, I'm very excited that it's getting out there, because also, when you learn the history of this, it turns out that the U.S. was central to how the Balfour Declaration got written. It was being pushed by the Zionists in Britain, telling Britain, this was during the Great War, as they called World War I. Britain was losing the war. They lost something like 58,000 men in one day of battle. The Zionists told them, we can help you get the U.S. into the war on your side if you then promise us to help us get Palestine after the war, because then they would have defeated the Ottoman Empire. So the Balfour Declaration was a war measure given by the British to the Zionists in a promise by which the Zionists said that they would have the power and they would get the U.S. to enter the war on the side of Britain. A great many historians write about that. The British believed it had happened. The Zionists bragged that they had done that. It's an important subject to look into. I don't know if it was the decisive factor at all for the U.S. entry into World War I, but the British believed it was, and this is why the Balfour Declaration was proclaimed. It wasn't even written by Lord Balfour. He officially signed it. It was written by other people, including Americans. The drafts went back and forth between London and between the United States before they had the final draft that became the Balfour Declaration.
Since you mentioned the Balfour Declaration, I'd like to just note that there was one opposition to it from the cabinet, and it was Jewish vote was against the thing. You know,
That's right. At that time, the Jewish population largely was opposed to Zionism.
So
in general,
Sir Montgomery, I think something like that. I forget his name, but he was the only British cabinet minister that opposed the Balfour Declaration and he was the only Jewish minister at that stage. But you know, I'd like to go a bit wrap it up, and if you could tell us about your tour for the book and how is it doing and how the book is doing, and also if you could tell our listeners where they can get it, please.
Oh, sure, I'd like to. The title, the short title is Against Our Better Judgement. It's sold on Amazon, so you can easily get it either in hard copy or on Kindle. We set the price quite low because we want lots of people to be able to read it. The book tour has gone very well. I've just gotten back after having been gone about 2 weeks around the East Coast, from Boston to Florida, sort of a little spotty, Delaware, Virginia, New York. And people are finding the book very interesting because it does contain some aspects of Zionism that almost no one has known about. So it's getting a great reception. Zionists, of course, don't like it at all. But and so again, you can get the website If Americans Knew. You can go there for more information about me and about the book itself, and there's a link for getting the book.
Okay, that's great. I just want to correct myself because the name of the minister was Sir Montagu. For people, if they want to Google it, he was the only Jewish minister who opposed the Balfour Declaration. Again, thank you, Alison.
That's right. And
go ahead.
I was just going to say he was. There were others that also opposed it, but he was definitely very central to it.
Oh actually, you know, if we want to talk about this during the First Zionist Congress in 1897, the first people who opposed it were they issued actually a statement called the Anti-Zionist Manifesto. It was issued by the German rabbis, you know, in Germany, the Council of German Rabbis, and they issued their Anti-Zionist Manifesto. So they were the first one to oppose it, and that was in 1897, you know.
That's right, and I think what a lot of people don't know is how many Christian leaders opposed it from the very beginning.
Yeah, that's true.
A lot of people have never heard of a prominent Dead Sea scholar opposed it. The two most celebrated Christian ministers
not to mention
opposed it.
Not to mention the Palestinian Christians, who I'm one of, that opposed this Zionist ideology all along since its inception.
So there was there was a great deal of opposition. The Jewish population, the Christian leadership and population, the State Department, the Pentagon.
Yeah, I mean, it's a settler colonialist project, and should be dealt as such. It's inhuman, and it's really racist in its concept and its in dimensions, So, again, I thank you, Alison, and keep up the good work, and hopefully we'll talk again. Feel free, if you have anything important, just to contact us, and we'll talk. Thank
you very much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Inviting me to be on.
You're welcome. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.